The security camera footage had been sitting on Thomas's phone for 3 days before he finally showed it to his brother. They sat in the dark living room, the blue glow from the television screen casting shadows across their faces as the video played in silence. "Pause it there," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. On screen, 2 women laughed as they danced with men who weren't their husbands. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. from the previous weekend. The same weekend, David and Thomas had been working their rotation on the offshore drilling platform. "The blonde one is yours," Thomas said, pointing at the screen. "Mine's the brunette by the kitchen counter." David stared at his wife, Sarah, as she kissed a man he didn't recognize. The man's hands were on her waist, pulling her closer. In the background, Thomas's wife, Michelle, was doing shots with another stranger. "Where did you get this?" David asked, his voice steady despite the storm building inside his chest. "Motion sensor on the back patio. They used our place while we were gone. Figured nobody would check the cameras." Thomas's finger hovered over the delete button. "Want me to trash it?" David reached over and stopped his brother's hand. "Don't you dare delete that." The room fell silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. David's mind was already working, calculating, planning. 22 years of marriage, 18 years of offshore rotations, countless nights away from home, working 14-hour shifts on the drilling platform to provide for his family. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. David stood up slowly, his joints creaking from years of physical labor. At 45, he felt every day of his age, every hour spent bent over machinery in the Gulf of Mexico heat. "I'm thinking," David said, walking to the window and looking out at the suburban neighborhood where they'd both bought houses 5 years ago, "that I need to be very careful about what I do next." The next morning, David arrived home to find Sarah making breakfast for their 16-year-old daughter, Emma. The kitchen smelled like bacon and coffee, the same domestic scene he'd returned to hundreds of times over the years. Sarah looked up from the stove and smiled. "You're home early," she said, walking over to kiss his cheek. "How was the rotation?" David accepted the kiss, studying his wife's face for any sign of guilt or deception. Sarah looked the same as always. Shoulder-length brown hair, tired eyes from her job at the county clerk's office, the small scar above her left eyebrow from when Emma had thrown a toy at her as a toddler. "Smooth operation," David said. "Made good time coming back." Emma looked up from her phone. "Dad, can I get a ride to Jessica's house later? Mom said she's too tired to drive." "Of course," David said, sitting down at the kitchen table. Sarah placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "What's Jessica up to?" "Just hanging out. Maybe watching a movie." David nodded, cutting into his eggs. "Sarah, remember that power of attorney paperwork I had you sign last month? For the offshore emergency fund?" Sarah paused and wiping down the counter. "Yeah, what about it?" "Nothing. Just making sure all our legal stuff is in order." David took a bite of bacon. "Company's been pushing everyone to get their affairs organized. Insurance purposes." The lie came easily. In reality, David had been slowly moving assets into a trust fund for months, long before he'd seen the video. Working offshore had taught him to prepare for disasters. He just hadn't expected the disaster to come from inside his own home. After breakfast, David drove Emma to her friend's house, then returned home to find Sarah in the shower. He sat in his home office, a small room off the main hallway that Sarah rarely entered, and pulled up the security system on his computer. The house had a comprehensive smart home setup. Cameras, motion sensors, even audio recording in the common areas. David had installed it all himself 2 years ago after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. Sarah had complained about the cost, but she'd appreciated the security. What she didn't know was that David had installed a secondary system, one that backed up everything to a separate server in the garage. The main system could be accessed by both of them through an app on their phones. The backup system was David's alone. He pulled up the footage from the night of the party and watched it again, this time with the sound turned on. He could hear Sarah laughing, hear her talking to the man she'd been kissing. "My husband won't be back until Tuesday," Sarah's voice came through the speakers. "We can stay as late as we want." David closed the laptop and sat back in his chair. The betrayal cut deep, but what hurt more was the casual way she dismissed him, as if he was just an obstacle to be worked around. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "You okay? Haven't heard from you since yesterday." David typed back. "Fine, just thinking. Want to grab a beer? Michelle's working late." David almost smiled at that. Michelle worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and David was willing to bet she wasn't actually working late. The footage from the party had shown her exchanging numbers with the man she'd been dancing with. "Sure," David typed. "Meet you at Murphy's in an hour." Murphy's Tavern was a dive bar frequented by offshore workers and construction crews. The drinks were cheap, the music was loud, and nobody asked questions. David and Thomas sat in a corner booth, nursing their beers and watching a basketball game on the television above the bar. "So, what's the plan?" Thomas asked after they'd been sitting in silence for 10 minutes. "Plan? Come on, David, I know you. You've been working offshore for 20 years. You don't do anything without a plan." David took a long sip of his beer. "First thing I'm going to do is gather information. Evidence." "Then what?" "Then I'm going to destroy them." Thomas stared at his brother. "You sure about this? Maybe we could just confront them. Try to work things out." "Work things out?" David's voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "Thomas, your wife was making out with a stranger in our kitchen. My wife was planning when you and I would be gone so she could throw a party. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated." Thomas looked down at his beer. Michelle's been different lately, distant. I thought it was just work stress. How long has she been distant? Maybe 6 months. Around the time she started going out with her girlfriends more often. David nodded. Sarah's been doing the same thing. Says she needs more me time now that Emma's older. They sat in silence, watching the basketball game neither of them cared about. Finally, Thomas spoke up. What kind of evidence are you looking for? Financial records, phone records, travel history? I want to know everything. David finished his beer and signaled the waitress for another. The smart home system records audio in the common areas. I'm going to see what else I can find. That's legal. It's my house, my system. Everything's in my name. David smiled grimly. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're the only one who reads the fine print. Over the next week, David fell into a routine. He would return from his offshore rotation, act normal around Sarah and Emma, then spend his free time reviewing the security footage and financial records. What he found made his blood run cold. The party hadn't been a one-time thing. Sarah had been having men over regularly for months, always when David was offshore. She'd been using their joint credit card to pay for dinners and hotel rooms. She'd even used their vacation fund to buy new clothes and jewelry. But the real discovery came when David accessed Sarah's work computer remotely. As the county clerk, Sarah had access to property records, legal filings, and other sensitive information. David found email exchanges between Sarah and her lover, a man named Jake Peterson who worked for a competing drilling company. The emails revealed that Sarah had been sharing information about David's offshore schedule, his income, and even details about the security system. Jake had been using the information to plan when it was safe to visit the house. In one email, Sarah had written, David's so obsessed with his work, he doesn't even notice what's happening at home. We could probably rob the place and he'd think it was an equipment malfunction. David printed out the emails and stored them in a fireproof safe in the garage, along with copies of all the video footage. Then he began phase 2 of his plan. The trust fund he'd been setting up for months was finally ready. David had been moving money slowly, a few $100s at a time, making it look like routine investment transfers. The house deed was already in the trust's name, as was his truck and his boat. Legally, David owned nothing, but he controlled everything through the trust. Sarah's name wasn't on any of it. The next step was more delicate. David needed to document Sarah's infidelity in a way that would hold up in court. But he also needed to protect himself legally. He couldn't simply confront her with the evidence. That would give her time to prepare a counterattack. Instead, David decided to let Sarah's own actions destroy her. He started by setting up a meeting with the company's legal department. As an offshore supervisor, David had legitimate reasons to consult with the lawyers about worker safety and liability issues. But during the meeting, he casually mentioned concerns about employee security clearances and information sharing. Hypothetically, David said to the company lawyer, if someone was sharing offshore schedules or personnel information with competitors, what would be the consequences? The lawyer's expression grew serious. That would be a major security breach. We've had problems with industrial espionage in the past. Anyone caught sharing sensitive information would face immediate termination and possible criminal charges. Even if it was just pillow talk? Someone bragging to their girlfriend about work? Especially then. Personal relationships are the most common source of security breaches. The lawyer leaned forward. David, is there something specific you're concerned about? Just want to make sure all my guys understand the rules, David said. Thanks for your time. That evening, David had dinner with Emma while Sarah worked late at the county office. His daughter had been quiet lately, spending more time in her room and less time with the family. David wondered if she'd noticed the tension between her parents. Dad, Emma said, poking at her mashed potatoes. Are you and Mom okay? David looked up from his steak. Why do you ask? You guys don't talk to each other anymore, and Mom's been weird. She's always on her phone, and she gets angry when I ask her about stuff. David set down his fork. Emma was smart, much smarter than either of her parents had been at her age. She'd been accepted to 3 colleges already, with plans to study engineering. Your mom and I are going through some things, David said carefully. But no matter what happens, you know I love you, right? Emma nodded, but her eyes were worried. Are you guys getting divorced? I don't know, sweetheart, but if we do, it won't be your fault. And I'll make sure you're taken care of. That night, after Sarah came home from her late night at the office, David lay in bed listening to her shower. When she climbed into bed beside him, he could smell unfamiliar cologne on her skin. How was work? He asked in the darkness. Busy. We're preparing for the property tax assessments next month. Another lie. David had checked the county office's schedule. There were no late-night sessions planned for the rest of the month. The next morning, David made his move. He printed out copies of Sarah's emails and the video footage from the party, then drove to the county courthouse. He requested a meeting with Sarah's supervisor, claiming he had concerns about information security. David had done his homework. Sarah's boss, Patricia Williams, was a no-nonsense woman who'd been with the county for 30 years. She'd survived multiple political administrations by running a tight ship and avoiding scandals. Mr. Thompson, what can I do for you? Patricia asked, gesturing for David to sit down in her office. I'm here about my wife, Sarah Thompson. She works in your department. Patricia's expression became guarded. Is there a problem? David handed her a manila envelope. I believe Sarah has been sharing sensitive information with unauthorized individuals. I have documentation. Patricia opened the envelope and examined the contents. Her face grew pale as she read the emails and looked at the timestamps on the video footage. This is very serious, she said finally. I'll need to conduct a formal investigation. I understand. I just felt it was my duty to report it. David left the courthouse feeling no satisfaction, only a cold determination to see the plan through to its conclusion. He drove to Thomas's house and found his brother sitting on the front porch, drinking coffee and staring at nothing. Michelle's gone, Thomas said without looking up. Took her stuff and moved in with her sister. David sat down in the chair next to his brother. When? Yesterday. Said she needed space to figure things out. Thomas laughed bitterly. 20 years of marriage, and she needs space to figure things out. Did you confront her about the video? Yeah. She denied it at first, then said it was just harmless fun. Then she got angry and said I was spying on her. Thomas shook his head. She made me feel like I was the bad guy. David understood. That was how it worked. The guilty party always tried to flip the script, make the sufferer feel like they were the problem. What are you going to do? David asked. I don't know. Maybe she's right. Maybe I should have paid more attention to her. Maybe if I'd been home more... Stop. David's voice cut through Thomas's self-pity. You didn't cheat. You didn't betray 20 years of marriage. You didn't bring strangers into your home and laugh about it? Thomas looked at his brother with tired eyes. So what do? You protect yourself. Legally, financially, emotionally. You document everything and you prepare for war. I don't want to fight her. She's already fighting you. She's been fighting you for months. You just didn't know it. That afternoon, David returned home to find Sarah pacing in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking in hushed tones, but David could hear enough to know she was talking to Jake Peterson. I can't talk right now, Sarah was saying. Something's happened at work. I might be in trouble. David pretended to be looking through the mail, but he was listening to every word. No, I don't think David knows anything. He's too stupid to figure it out. Sarah's voice was sharp with stress. Look, I need to go. I'll call you tonight. She hung up the phone and turned to find David watching her. Everything okay? He asked mildly. Fine. Just work stuff. Sarah's smile was forced. How was your day? Good. Had some errands to run downtown. That evening, David and Sarah sat through dinner in tense silence. Emma picked at her food and avoided eye contact with both parents. The family dynamic had shifted dramatically in just a few weeks, and everyone could feel it. After dinner, Emma excused herself to do homework. Sarah disappeared into the bedroom to make phone calls. David sat in his office reviewing the evidence he'd gathered. Everything was in place. Now he just had to wait for the dominoes to fall. The first domino fell 3 days later. Sarah came home from work in tears, her face red with anger and humiliation. They suspended me, she announced, throwing her purse on the kitchen counter. Patricia Williams suspended me pending investigation. David looked up from his newspaper. Investigation? For what? They're saying I shared confidential information with unauthorized individuals. It's complete garbage. Who would say something like that? Sarah's eyes narrowed. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Someone's trying to sabotage me. Emma came into the kitchen, drawn by her mother's raised voice. Mom, what's wrong? Nothing, sweetheart. Just some problems at work. Sarah's voice softened when she spoke to Emma, but the anger was still there underneath. That night, David heard Sarah on the phone with Jake Peterson. She was crying, begging him to help her figure out who had reported her. Jake's response was apparently less than supportive because Sarah's voice grew louder and more desperate. You can't just abandon me now, she was saying. We're in this together. There was a long pause, then Sarah's voice cracked. What do you mean you can't see me anymore? Jake, please, I need you. David heard the phone slam against the wall, followed by Sarah's muffled sobs. He felt no satisfaction in her pain, only a cold emptiness where his marriage used to be. The second domino fell a week later. Jake Peterson lost his job with the competing drilling company after David's employer filed a complaint about industrial espionage. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough to raise questions about Jake's reliability. Without a job, Jake apparently decided that Sarah was more trouble than she was worth. He stopped returning her calls and blocked her on social media. Sarah's desperation grew more obvious by the day. She started drinking more, staying up late, scrolling through her phone and muttering to herself. She snapped at Emma over minor issues and spent hours locked in the bathroom crying. David watched it all with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. He felt like he was watching a stranger destroy herself, not the woman he'd been married to for 22 years. The third domino was the most personal. Emma came to David's office one evening, her face serious and determined. Dad, I need to talk to you about something. David saved the spreadsheet he'd been working on and turned to give his daughter his full attention. What's on your mind? Emma closed the door behind her and sat down in the chair across from his desk. She looked nervous but resolute. I know about Mom, she said quietly. I know what she's been doing. David's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I saw the videos, Dad, on your computer. The screen was still on when I came in here to get a pen last week. David closed his eyes. He'd been so careful to keep the evidence away from Emma, but she was too smart and too observant to miss the signs. Emma, I can explain. You don't have to explain anything. Emma's voice was steady, but there were tears in her eyes. Mom's been cheating on you. I figured it out weeks ago. How? The phone calls, the new clothes, the way she's been acting? Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And the way she's been treating you? Like you're just in the way. David came around the desk and pulled his daughter into a hug. She clung to him like she used to when she was little and had nightmares. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, David said. I was trying to protect you from it. I know, but Dad, I'm not a little girl anymore. I can handle the truth. They held each other for a long moment. Two people who'd been betrayed by someone they trusted completely. What are you going to do? Emma asked when they finally separated. I'm going to make sure you and I are taken care of, David said. No matter what happens with your mother. I want to live with you, Emma said firmly. After the divorce, I mean. I want to live with you. David felt his heart break a little more. Emma shouldn't have to choose between her parents, but Sarah had made that choice inevitable. We'll figure it out, David promised. Together. The fourth domino fell when Sarah's investigation at work concluded. The county attorney's office decided that while they couldn't prove criminal intent, Sarah's actions constituted a serious breach of confidentiality protocols. She was terminated immediately, with no severance package and no possibility of rehire. Sarah came home that afternoon like a hurricane, slamming doors and throwing things. Emma retreated to her room while David sat calmly at the kitchen table watching his wife self-destruct. This is your fault, Sarah screamed at him. You did this to me. You reported me to Patricia Williams. David looked up from his coffee. I reported a security breach. I had no choice. Security breach? I never told Jake anything important. It was just casual conversation. You gave him my work schedule. You told him about our security system. You shared confidential county information. David's voice remained calm and level. What would you call that? Sarah's face went white. She hadn't realized how much David knew. How did you... She started, then stopped herself. How did I find out? The same way any reasonable person would find out. I paid attention. Sarah sank into a chair across from him, suddenly looking older than her 43 years. David, we need to talk. About us. About our marriage. What about it? I know things haven't been good between us. I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling. David almost laughed. After months of betrayal, after destroying their family, after humiliating him in front of the entire community, Sarah wanted to work things out. I don't think so, he said quietly. What do you mean? I mean, I'm done. With you, with this marriage, with pretending everything is fine. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You can't mean that. We have a history together. We have Emma. Emma will be fine. She's stronger than both of us. David, please. I love you. I made a mistake, but I love you. David stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful and normal. Kids playing in yards, neighbors walking their dogs. The illusion of suburban harmony. You love me, he repeated. When did you decide that? Before or after Jake stopped returning your calls? Sarah flinched as if he'd slapped her. That's not fair. Fair? David turned back to her. You want to talk about fair? Was it fair when you brought strangers into our home? Was it fair when you laughed about how stupid I was? Was it fair when you used our vacation money to buy clothes for your affair? Sarah's tears were flowing freely now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. You were thinking that I was too stupid to find out. You were thinking that I was just a paycheck who happened to live in your house. David's voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath. You were thinking that you could have your cake and eat it too. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you asked me about my day? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life, my work, my feelings? David shook his head. You checked out of this marriage years ago. You just forgot to tell me. Sarah tried to respond, but David held up his hand. I'm filing for divorce, he said. Emma can choose where she wants to live. As for the house, the cars, the bank accounts, well, we'll let the lawyers sort that out. Sarah's face went from devastated to angry in seconds. You can't just kick me out. This is my house, too. Actually, it's not. What do you mean? David walked back to the table and sat down across from her. I mean, your name isn't on the deed. It hasn't been for 6 months. Sarah stared at him in confusion. That's impossible. We bought this house together. We did, but I refinanced it last year, remember? To get a better interest rate? I had you sign some papers. The color drained from Sarah's face as she realized what David was telling her. Those weren't refinancing papers. No, they were trust documents. The house, the cars, the bank accounts. They're all in a trust now. A trust that I control. Sarah stood up so fast, her chair fell over. You can't do that. That's fraud. It's not fraud when you sign the papers willingly. You just didn't bother to read what you were signing. David smiled grimly. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're the only one who pays attention to details. Sarah was shaking with rage now. I'll fight you. I'll get a lawyer and I'll fight you for everything. With what money? You just lost your job. Your credit cards are maxed out from your shopping sprees with Jake, and your boyfriend isn't going to help you. He's too busy trying to find a new job. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. She really was trapped, with no money, no job, and no allies. You planned this, she whispered. You planned all of this. I prepared for this, David corrected. There's a difference. That night, Sarah didn't come to bed. David found her the next morning sleeping on the couch, fully clothed, an empty wine bottle on the coffee table beside her. Emma came downstairs for breakfast and saw her mother passed out on the couch. She looked at David with sad, adult eyes. Is she going to be okay? Emma asked. I don't know, David said honestly. That's up to her. Over the next few days, Sarah made several attempts to reach out to old friends and family members, looking for support and sympathy. The results were disappointing. Most people had already heard about her affair through the small-town gossip network. Those who hadn't were quickly filled in by Sarah's desperate, rambling phone calls. Her sister Linda was blunt. Sarah, you made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. Her best friend from high school was more diplomatic, but equally unsympathetic. I just think you need to focus on getting your life together. For Emma's sake? Even Sarah's mother, who had always taken her daughter's side in any conflict, was cold and distant. I don't understand how you could do this to David. He's been nothing but good to you and Emma. The isolation began to eat away at Sarah's already fragile mental state. She started drinking earlier in the day and spending hours on social media, scrolling through photos of her old life and leaving increasingly erratic comments on friends' posts. Emma spent more and more time at the library or with friends, avoiding the toxic atmosphere at home. When she was there, she stayed in her room with the door locked. David continued his normal routine: work, home, dinner, quiet evenings in his office. He was polite but distant with Sarah, treating her like an unwelcome housiguest who'd overstayed her welcome. The final domino fell on a Tuesday evening in late March. David was reviewing college brochures with Emma when they heard a car pull into the driveway. Sarah had been out all afternoon, claiming she was job hunting, but David suspected she was actually at a bar. The front door slammed open and Sarah stumbled in, clearly drunk. She was followed by a man David didn't recognize. Tall, thin, with greasy hair and the smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne. David, Sarah called out in a slurred voice. I want you to meet someone. This is Rick. Rick, this is my husband, David. Emma looked at her father with wide, frightened eyes. David stood up slowly, his body tense with controlled anger. Sarah, you need to get this man out of my house, David said quietly. Your house? Sarah laughed bitterly. It's still my house too. Until the divorce is final, I can bring whoever I want here. Rick stepped forward, swaying slightly. You got a problem with me being here? David studied the man for a moment. Rick was younger than Sarah, maybe 35, with the look of someone who'd spent more time in bars than at work. He was trying to act tough, but David could see the uncertainty in his eyes. I don't have a problem with you, David said calmly. I have a problem with you being in my house. Maybe you should mind your own business, old man. Emma stood up from the couch. Mom, please, just make him leave. Sarah ignored her daughter and moved closer to Rick, putting her arm around his waist. Rick's going to stay for dinner. Aren't you, baby? David looked at Emma, then back at Sarah. His daughter was scared and embarrassed, watching her mother make a spectacle of herself with a stranger. Emma, go to your room, David said softly. Dad, go to your room. Now! Emma hurried upstairs, but David knew she'd be listening from the top of the stairs. He turned back to Sarah and Rick. You have two choices, David said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel. You can leave voluntarily, or I can call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Rick laughed. Trespassing? Your wife invited me here. My wife doesn't have the authority to invite anyone here. This house is held in a trust, and I'm the sole trustee. You're trespassing. Sarah's face flushed with anger. You can't do this, David. I still live here. For now, but that can change very quickly. David pulled out his phone and started dialing. 911? I need to report a trespassing incident. Rick's bravado evaporated. Hey, wait a minute. I don't want any trouble. Then leave, David said, still holding the phone to his ear. Rick looked at Sarah, who was glaring at David with pure hatred. Maybe I should go, babe. This isn't worth it. Don't you dare leave me, Sarah said, grabbing Rick's arm. Stand up to him. But Rick was already backing toward the door. I'll call you later, Sarah, when things calm down. He left without another word, his footsteps echoing on the front porch. Sarah stood in the middle of the living room, swaying slightly, looking lost and broken. You humiliated me, she said, her voice thick with tears and booze. You humiliated yourself, David replied. In front of your daughter. Sarah looked toward the stairs where Emma was undoubtedly listening. For a moment, her face crumpled with shame and regret. I'm her mother, Sarah whispered. Then act like it. That night, David heard Sarah throwing up in the bathroom. He didn't get up to help her. The next morning, she was gone. She'd packed a suitcase and left a note saying she was staying with a friend and would be back for the rest of her things later. Emma found the note first and brought it to David. She was crying quietly, the kind of deep, silent tears that come when childhood finally ends. She's really gone, Emma said. David pulled his daughter close. Yeah, she's really gone. Are you okay? David considered the question. Was he okay? His marriage was over. His family was broken. His life had been turned upside down by betrayal and lies. But he was also free from the constant tension, the walking on eggshells, the pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I'm going to be okay, he said. We're going to be okay. The divorce proceedings took 6 months. Sarah hired a lawyer with money borrowed from her sister, but the legal battle was over before it began. The prenup David had insisted on when they'd married, combined with the trust structure he'd set up, left Sarah with very little leverage. She got half of their joint savings account, about $3,000, and her personal possessions. Everything else stayed with David, including primary custody of Emma. Sarah fought for more, claiming she'd been tricked into signing the trust documents, but the evidence was against her. She'd signed the papers in front of a notary, and there was documentation showing she'd been advised to seek independent legal counsel. The final hearing was on a cold day in November. David sat in the courthouse with his lawyer, watching Sarah sign the divorce papers with shaking hands. She looked older than her 44 years, worn down by months of stress and uncertainty. When it was over, Sarah's lawyer gathered up the papers and left quickly. Sarah lingered in the hallway, looking like she wanted to say something to David. "I hope you're happy," she said finally. David looked at the woman he'd been married to for 22 years. "I'm not happy, Sarah, but I'm at peace. I loved you, you know. I really did love you. Maybe you did, but it wasn't enough." Sarah nodded slowly, tears running down her cheeks. "Take care of Emma." "I will." She walked away without looking back, her heels clicking on the marble courthouse floor. David watched her go, feeling nothing but emptiness where his anger used to be. That evening, David and Emma had dinner at their favorite restaurant, a small Italian place they'd been going to since Emma was little. It was their tradition for celebrating important occasions, and the end of the divorce proceedings seemed important enough. "So what now?" Emma asked, twirling spaghetti around her fork. "Now we figure out what comes next," David said. "You've got college applications to finish. I've got to decide whether to keep working offshore or find something closer to home." "I'd like it if you were home more." David smiled. "Then that's what I'll do." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching other families around them. Normal families, David thought, with their normal problems and normal lives. "Dad," Emma said suddenly. "Yeah? I'm proud of you, for how you handled everything. You could have been mean about it, but you weren't." David reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. "I was mean about it. I destroyed your mother's life. She destroyed her own life. You just documented it." David laughed, despite himself. "You're too smart for your own good. I get it from my dad." As they drove home that night, David thought about the future. Emma would be leaving for college in 8 months. He'd be alone in the house he'd fought so hard to keep. Maybe he'd sell it and find something smaller. Maybe he'd travel. Maybe he'd try dating again, though that seemed impossible to imagine. For now, though, he was content. He'd protected his daughter and himself. He'd learned that he was stronger than he'd thought, more capable of surviving betrayal than he'd imagined. The house was quiet when they got home. Emma went upstairs to work on homework while David sat in his office, looking through the evidence files he'd accumulated over the months. He could delete them now. The divorce was final. The battles were over. But something made him hesitate. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Thomas's number. "Hey," David answered. "It's done," Thomas said. His voice sounded hollow. "Michelle signed the papers today. It's officially over." David closed the evidence files. "How are you holding up?" "Like I got hit by a truck, but a truck I saw coming from a mile away." Thomas paused. "Want to grab a beer? I could use some company that isn't a lawyer." "Sure. Murphy's?" "Actually, let's try somewhere new. I'm tired of that place." They met at a restaurant on the other side of town, a place neither of them had been before. Thomas looked exhausted, but oddly relieved, like a man who'd finally put down a heavy load he'd been carrying too long. "So what's next for you?" David asked after they'd ordered. "I'm thinking about selling the house. Too many memories." Thomas took a sip of his beer. "Maybe move closer to my sister in Dallas. Start fresh. That might be good for you." "What about you? Staying put?" David considered the question. "For now. Emma's got her senior year to finish. After that, who knows?" They talked about practical things. Lawyers, property division, custody arrangements. But underneath the surface conversation was a deeper understanding. They were both survivors of something that had nearly destroyed them. They'd both learned things about themselves they'd never wanted to know. "You ever wonder if we could have prevented it?" Thomas asked suddenly. "If we'd paid more attention, been home more, been different somehow?" David had asked himself the same question 1,000 times. "No," he said finally. "We were good husbands. We worked hard, provided for our families, loved our wives. What they did, that was their choice. Michelle tried to blame me at the end, said I was cold, distant, said I cared more about work than her. Sarah said something similar, but you know what? Even if that was true, even if we were terrible husbands, that didn't give them the right to cheat. It gave them the right to ask for counseling, or separation, or divorce. Not to lie and sneak around and humiliate us." Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know you're right. It hurts, you know? 20 years, and I never saw it coming. Maybe that says more about us than them. Maybe we're just the kind of people who trust until we have a reason not to." They finished their beers in comfortable silence, two men who'd been through hell and come out the other side scarred, but intact. A month later, David was working in his garage when Emma came out to tell him he had a visitor. He looked up from the boat engine he was rebuilding to see Jake Peterson standing in his driveway. Jake looked terrible, unshaven, thin, wearing clothes that had seen better days. He was clearly nervous, shifting from foot to foot and avoiding eye contact. "What do you want?" David asked, not bothering to wipe the grease from his hands. "I need to talk to you," Jake said, "about Sarah." David set down his wrench and really looked at the man who'd helped destroy his marriage. Jake was younger than David, maybe 38, with the kind of smooth good looks that probably made him popular with women. But up close, David could see the weakness in his face, the character flaws that Sarah had apparently overlooked. "What about her? She's been calling me a lot. She's not doing well." David almost laughed. "And you want me to do something about that?" "She needs help, professional help. She's drinking too much, not taking care of herself. She's talking about—" Jake trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Talking about what?" "Hurting herself, maybe worse." David felt a chill run down his spine. Despite everything Sarah had done, he didn't want her to hurt herself. For Emma's sake, if nothing else. "Where is she staying?" "Some apartment complex on the south side. Real dump. She can't afford anything better." Jake looked genuinely distressed. "I tried to help her, but she's obsessed with you, with getting back at you. She blames you for everything. Of course she does. Look, I know you hate me. I know what we did was wrong, but Sarah, she's not the same person she was when we were together. Something's broken inside her." David studied Jake's face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. All he saw was genuine worry and guilt. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do about it?" "I don't know. Maybe call her sister or her mother. Someone who can get her into therapy or rehab or something." Jake ran his hands through his hair. "I can't be the one to help her. I'm part of the problem." David had to give Jake credit for that much self-awareness. "You're right. You are part of the problem. I know, and I'm sorry for all of it. I never meant for things to go this far." "What did you think would happen? That we'd all just be friends? That I'd be okay with you sleeping with my wife?" Jake flinched. I thought you guys were already separated. Sarah told me your marriage was over, that you were just staying together for Emma." Another lie from Sarah. David wasn't surprised. "My marriage was fine until you came along," David said. "Not perfect, maybe, but fine. We were a family." "I'm sorry," Jake said again. "I really am." David looked at this man who'd helped destroy his life and felt nothing but pity. Jake had thrown away his career and his reputation for an affair with a married woman, and now he was stuck dealing with the consequences. "Don't come to my house again," David said finally, "but I'll call Sarah's sister. For Emma's sake." Jake nodded gratefully and turned to leave. Then he stopped and looked back. "For what it's worth, Sarah really did love you. She talked about you all the time, about how smart you were, how hard you worked. I think that's why she's taking this so hard. If she loved me, she had a funny way of showing it." Jake didn't have an answer for that. He walked to his beat-up Honda and drove away, leaving David alone with his thoughts and his boat engine. That evening, David called Sarah's sister, Linda. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. Linda confirmed that Sarah was struggling and agreed to stage an intervention with their mother. David gave her the address Jake had provided and hung up feeling like he'd done his duty. 2 weeks later, Linda called back. Sarah was in a treatment facility getting help for depression and booze misuse. She'd be there for at least 30 days, possibly longer. "She asked me to tell you something," Linda said. "She wanted you to know she's sorry for everything." David thanked Linda and hung up. He felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Sarah was getting help. Sadness that it had come to this. Spring turned into summer, and life developed a new rhythm. David took a job with a local construction company, giving up the higher pay of offshore work for the chance to be home every night. Emma flourished with the stability, her grades improving and her college prospects brightening. They heard occasional updates about Sarah through Linda. She'd completed the treatment program and was living in a halfway house, working as a clerk at a grocery store. She was sober and attending therapy, slowly rebuilding her life one day at a time. Emma asked about visiting her mother, and David didn't object. Their meetings were awkward, but civil, supervised visits in public places where Sarah could apologize and Emma could begin to forgive. "She looks different," Emma told David after one such visit. "Older, sadder, but maybe a little wiser too." David hoped that was true. For Emma's sake, he wanted Sarah to find peace and happiness. Not with him. That bridge was burned beyond repair. But somewhere, with someone who could appreciate what she had to offer. As Emma's senior year began, David started thinking seriously about his own future. He was 46 years old, financially secure, and completely single for the first time in over 2 decades. The prospect was both terrifying and exciting. He started small, joining a gym, taking a cooking class, accepting invitations to social events he'd previously avoided. Slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild his life as an individual rather than half of a couple. The first woman he went on a date with was a teacher at Emma's school, a divorced mother of 2 who understood the complexities of starting over. Nothing came of it romantically, but they became friends, and she helped David realize that he was ready to trust again, at least in small doses. Meanwhile, Thomas had indeed moved to Dallas and seemed to be thriving. He'd found work with an engineering firm and was dating a woman he'd met at a church barbecue. In their weekly phone calls, he sounded happier than David had heard him in years. "The thing about starting over," Thomas said during one conversation, is that you get to decide who you want to be. You're not locked into the person you were before. David understood what his brother meant, the man he'd been during his marriage, the provider, the protector, the one who ignored warning signs to keep the peace. That man was gone. In his place was someone harder but also more honest, less trusting but more self-aware. October brought college acceptance letters and scholarship offers. Emma had her pick of schools, and she chose an engineering program at a university 3 hours away. Close enough to visit, far enough to be independent. "Are you sure you're going to be okay by yourself?" Emma asked as they toured the campus. "I'm sure," David said, and he meant it. "Besides, you'll be home for holidays and summers. At least for a while." They were walking across the quad when Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. Her face grew serious as she read it. "It's from Mom," she said. "She wants to know if we can meet for coffee before I leave for college." David felt the familiar tension in his shoulders. Even after all this time, any mention of Sarah still affected him. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to see her, but I want you to be there too." David's first instinct was to refuse. He and Sarah hadn't been in the same room since the divorce hearing almost a year ago, but Emma was asking, and Emma rarely asked for anything. "Okay," he said, "if that's what you want." They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that none of them had been to before. Sarah arrived first, looking nervous and much thinner than David remembered. She cut her hair short and wore simple clothes with no makeup. She looked like a different person from the woman who'd brought Jake Peterson to their house that night. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said when David and Emma sat down across from her. "Both of you. I wasn't sure you would." Emma reached across the table and squeezed her mother's hand. "How are you doing, Mom?" "Better. One day at a time." Sarah's voice was steady but quiet. "I'm working, going to meetings, seeing a therapist. It's hard, but it's good." David said nothing, content to let Emma lead the conversation. He studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of the woman he'd married, the woman he'd loved. She was still there, underneath the damage and the years, but changed in fundamental ways. "I wanted to apologize," Sarah said, looking directly at David for the first time. "Not just for the affair, but for everything. For the lying, the manipulation, the way I treated both of you. I was selfish and cruel, and I'm sorry." David nodded but didn't speak. Words were cheap, and Sarah had proven that actions mattered more than apologies. "I know you probably can't forgive me," Sarah continued. "I wouldn't forgive me if I were you. But I needed you to know that I take full responsibility for what happened. It wasn't your fault, David. You were a good husband, and I threw it away." "Why?" The word came out before David could stop it. "Why did you do it?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her coffee cup. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Oh, because I was lonely," she said simply, "and scared, and stupid. You were gone so much for work, and Emma was getting older and didn't need me as much, and I felt invisible, like I was just fading away." David wanted to point out that he'd worked offshore to provide for their family, that everything he'd done had been for Sarah and Emma. But he'd already said those things during the divorce, and they hadn't made any difference then. "I thought if someone else wanted me, if someone else found me exciting and attractive, then maybe I wasn't disappearing after all." Sarah's voice cracked. "I was wrong about everything. Jake didn't love me. He was just using me, and I destroyed the only real love I'd ever had." Emma was crying now, quiet tears that she wiped away with her napkin. David felt his own eyes burning, but kept his emotions in check. "I can't undo what I did," Sarah said, "but I can promise you that I'm working every day to become a better person. For me and for Emma." They talked for another hour, carefully navigating around the most painful topics. Sarah asked about Emma's college plans and David's new job. She didn't ask about his personal life, and he was grateful for that small mercy. When it was time to leave, Sarah hugged Emma tightly and whispered something in her ear that made Emma nod and smile through her tears. She turned to David and extended her hand. After a moment's hesitation, he shook it. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he said. "You too, both of you." David and Emma drove home in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Emma spoke up. "What did she whisper to you?" David asked. "She said she hopes someday you'll find someone who deserves you." Emma looked at her father. "I hope so too." David smiled. "Maybe someday. Right now, I'm pretty happy with just the two of us." The months passed quickly after that. Emma finished high school with honors and prepared for college. David continued working and slowly expanding his social circle. He went on a few more dates, nothing serious, but each one helped him remember what it felt like to connect with another person. Sarah kept her word about becoming a better person. She attended Emma's graduation ceremony, sitting in the back and applauding when Emma's name was called. Afterward, she congratulated Emma with a brief hug and left without trying to insert herself into the family celebration. The night before Emma left for college, she and David sat on the back porch, looking up at the stars and talking about the future. "Are you nervous?" David asked. "A little, but mostly excited." Emma leaned against his shoulder. "What about you? Nervous about having the house to yourself?" "A little," David admitted, "but mostly excited too. You should travel, see the world. You've never really been anywhere except for work." David had been thinking the same thing. He'd saved money by living modestly and working steady hours. He could afford to take some time off. Maybe visit Europe or Asia, places he'd only read about. Maybe I will, he said, after I get you settled in college. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their neighborhood. Tomorrow, Emma would start her adult life, and David would begin the next chapter of his own. Dad? Emma said suddenly. Thank you for everything, for fighting for me, for taking care of me, for showing me what it looks like to handle things with dignity. David felt his throat tighten with emotion. You don't need to thank me. You're my daughter. It's what fathers do. Not all fathers. I got lucky. The next morning, David helped Emma load her belongings into his truck for the drive to college. As they pulled out of the driveway, David looked back at the house he'd fought so hard to keep. It looked smaller somehow, less important than it had during the divorce. Maybe it was time to sell it after all. Maybe it was time to let go of the past completely and build something entirely new. 2 months after Emma started college, David ran into Jake Peterson at a grocery store. Jake looked better than he had during his visit to David's house. Cleaner, healthier, wearing work clothes that suggested he'd found employment. David, Jake said, clearly uncomfortable. How are you? Fine, David replied neutrally. You? Good, I'm working construction now. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work. Jake paused. I heard about Sarah getting help. I'm glad. David nodded, but said nothing. He had no interest in rehashing the past with Jake. Look, I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I need to say it. What we did was wrong, and I'm sorry. I've been going to therapy too, trying to figure out why I make such stupid decisions. Good for you, David said, meaning it. Everyone deserved a chance to become a better person, even Jake. I hope things work out for you. You seem like a good guy who got a raw deal. David almost smiled at that. We all get raw deals sometimes. It's what we do with them that matters. Jake nodded and walked away, leaving David alone with his thoughts and his groceries. The encounter hadn't upset him the way it might have a year ago. He felt nothing but indifference toward Jake Peterson now, and that felt like progress. That evening, David called Emma to tell her about running into Jake. She listened without comment, then changed the subject to her engineering classes and the friends she was making. You sound happy, David observed. I am. Really happy. College is everything I hoped it would be. Emma paused. Are you happy, Dad? David considered the question. Was he happy? His marriage was over. His family was scattered. His life had been turned upside down. But he was also free from lies and pretense. He had his daughter's love and respect. He had his health, his work, and a future full of possibilities. Yeah, he said, surprised to realize it was true. I think I am. Christmas brought Emma home for winter break, along with stories of college life and a boyfriend named Marcus who was studying architecture. David liked the way Emma lit up when she talked about Marcus, the same way her face had glowed when she was little and talked about her favorite books. Sarah called on Christmas morning to wish Emma well, but she didn't ask to see her. That was probably for the best. They were all healing in their own ways, and some wounds needed distance to mend properly. On New Year's Eve, David attended a party thrown by one of his coworkers. He almost didn't go. Parties reminded him too much of the video that had started everything. But Emma encouraged him to make an effort, and he was glad he listened. He met a woman named Carol, a nurse who'd moved to town 6 months earlier to be closer to her aging parents. She was funny and kind, with laugh lines around her eyes and a directness that David found refreshing. They talked for hours about work and family and the peculiar challenges of starting over in middle age. Carol had been divorced for 3 years and had teenage children of her own, so she understood the complexities of David's situation without judgment. Would you like to have dinner sometime? David asked as the party was winding down. I'd like that, Carol said, handing him her phone number. But I should warn you, I'm not looking for anything complicated. I've had enough drama to last a lifetime. That makes 2 of us, David said, and he meant it. Their first date was at a quiet restaurant where they could talk without shouting over loud music. Their second was a hiking trail where they discovered a shared love of nature. By their 5th date, David realized he was looking forward to seeing Carol more than he'd looked forward to anything in years. She was different from Sarah in every way that mattered. Where Sarah had been impulsive and emotional, Carol was steady and thoughtful. Where Sarah had been concerned with appearances and status, Carol valued honesty and authenticity. I like her, Emma said when she met Carol during spring break. She doesn't try too hard to impress me, and she doesn't act like she's trying to replace Mom. That was the thing David appreciated most about Carol. She understood that she was entering a life that already had a history. She didn't try to erase the past or compete with it. She simply offered something new and different. By summer, they were talking about moving in together. David's house held too many memories, and Carol's apartment was too small. They found a place on the other side of town, a smaller house with a garden that Carol loved and a workshop where David could tinker with engines. Thomas came to visit in July, bringing his girlfriend Helen to meet David and Emma. The 4 of them sat on the back porch of David's new house, drinking beer and watching the sunset. You look good, Thomas told his brother. Relaxed, happy. I feel good, David said, and it was true. The anger and bitterness that had consumed him during the divorce had faded, replaced by something that felt like contentment. Whatever happened to Sarah? Helen asked. Sorry, I don't mean to pry. Thomas told me a little about what happened. She's doing well, from what I hear, David said. Working, sober, getting her life together, that's all I need to know. Emma nodded approvingly. She'd seen her mother a few times over the past year, brief meetings that seemed to go well for both of them. Sarah was dating someone new, a man she'd met in therapy who understood her struggles and supported her recovery. It's weird, Emma said. I used to think divorce was this terrible thing that destroyed families. But in our case, I think it saved what was left of our family. We're all healthier apart than we were together. David couldn't argue with that. The family unit that had existed before the divorce had been built on lies and resentment. What they had now, honest relationships based on choice rather than obligation, was stronger, even if it looked different. As autumn approached and Emma prepared to return to college for her junior year, David found himself thinking about how much had changed in 3 years. The man who'd sat in his living room watching that security footage felt like a stranger now. Angry, hurt, plotting revenge. He'd gotten his revenge, of course. Sarah had lost her job, her marriage, her home, her reputation. She'd been forced to confront her demons and rebuild her life from scratch. David had emerged victorious in every measurable way. But somewhere along the journey from sufferer to victor, David had discovered that revenge was a hollow victory. What mattered wasn't punishing Sarah for her betrayal, but building something better from the wreckage of their marriage. The day Emma left for her junior year, David and Carol drove her to campus together. Emma hugged them both goodbye, promising to call that evening and visit for Thanksgiving. As they drove home, Carol reached over and took David's hand. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. "Just thinking about how different things are now. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. Turns out it was just beginning." Carol squeezed his hand. "The best part of starting over is that you get to choose what to keep from your old life and what to leave behind." David looked at the woman beside him, intelligent, compassionate, real in a way that Sarah had never been, and felt grateful for the journey that had brought them together. The betrayal and pain had been necessary, he realized. Without them, he never would have found the strength to demand better for himself. That evening, they sat in their garden watching Carol's tomatoes ripen in the late summer sun. David's phone rang with Emma's promised call, full of excitement about her new classes and updates about Marcus, who was spending a semester abroad in Italy. After they hung up, David and Carol sat in comfortable silence, each reading a book and occasionally commenting on interesting passages. It was the kind of quiet, intimate domesticity that David had always thought was boring when he was younger. Now he understood it was actually precious. "David?" Carol said, looking up from her novel. "Yeah? I love you." It was the first time either of them had said it. David set down his book and looked at this woman who'd taught him that it was possible to trust again, to love again, to build something new without trying to recreate what had been lost. "I love you too," he said, and meant it completely. They kissed in the fading light, two people who'd found each other after learning the hard way that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Years later, David would look back on the night he'd first seen that security footage as the moment his real life began. Not because of the revenge he'd planned, or the justice he'd served, but because it had forced him to stop accepting less than he deserved. Sarah had taught him about betrayal. Carol had taught him about redemption. Emma had taught him about unconditional love. And he taught himself that it was never too late to start over, to choose differently, to become the person he was meant to be. The house where his old life had died was sold to a young couple with small children. David drove by it sometimes and felt nothing but mild curiosity about the people who lived there now. The past was past, filed away in memory but no longer sharp enough to cut. On a warm evening in October, 5 years after the divorce, David sat on his porch with Carol and watched the neighborhood kids play in the street. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now in graduate school and engaged to Marcus. "Can't wait to see you both at Thanksgiving. Marcus is excited to meet Carol properly. Love you, Dad." David smiled and showed the message to Carol, who was knitting a scarf for Emma's birthday. "She's a good kid," Carol said. "You raised her right." "We all raised each other, I think." As the sun set over their quiet street, David reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed him had ultimately freed him to find real happiness. The revenge he'd planned so carefully had mattered less than the life he'd built afterward. Sometimes, the best victories weren't about defeating your enemies. Sometimes they were about outlasting your pain and discovering that joy was possible again. David reached for Carol's hand as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new moments to choose kindness over bitterness and hope over fear. But tonight, sitting with the woman he loved and the life they built together, David Thompson was exactly where he belonged. The end.